Chapter 30. The chapter begins with a recap of the story that involves Dr. Herbert Hopkins, with an experience that he had with a man in black. In 1976, Dr. Hopkins was treating an alien abductee named David Stevens using hypnotic regression, and Dr. Hopkins received a visit from a man in black. This man in black had an odd appearance since he didn't have any visible hair, not even eyebrows, and he acted strangely, and he had mechanical speech. The reason for the visit was that the man in black was warning Dr. Hopkins to stop treating David Stevens. And the way he threatened him was he made Dr. Hopkins hold a coin in his hand, and then he played some type of trick where the coin became blurry and then it disappeared completely. Then the man in black said that what happened to the coin was gonna happen to his heart, saying that his heart was gonna disappear. So Dr. Hopkins complied with the request, but even so, he was still experiencing men in black visits and UFO sightings for several weeks. Then Dr. Hopkins' son, John, also had a strange encounter with men in black. There were visitors that came to his home, and they were wearing black clothing, and they were asking John and his wife questions about how humans behave, and they were asking questions of a sexual nature, but the visitation stopped. So there was an update to the story in 2008. The nephew of Howard Hopkins, the nephew of Dr. Hopkins, his name was Howard Hopkins, and he wanted to add to the story. And it is mentioned that Howard Hopkins died in 2012 at the age of 50. So this story about Dr. Herbert Hopkins was a story that got national attention in the 1970s, and it went viral because multiple publications ran the story. And they did so because the doctor had a good reputation. And many people were saying that Dr. Hopkins was a brilliant man. So Howard Hopkins began speaking about his uncle, saying that he had alcohol and drug issues. Howard Hopkins said that his uncle was going through a tumultuous time in his life, and was drinking heavily, and that Dr. Hawkins was fascinated by 1950s sci-fi pulp stories, that he was an avid reader of 1950s horrors and sci-fi comics, paperbacks, and other things like that. And Howard was saying that his uncle was fantasy prone and that he liked being the center of attention. He said that his uncle, Dr. Hawkins, was drinking a lot in the 1970s and 80s, and that he was awoken by him in the pre-dawn hours by his uncle mumbling and cursing about some dog, the same dog that was next to Howard on his bed when he was sleeping. And the reason that this Dr. Hawkins got so much attention was because he had a good reputation. Howard said that he loved his uncle and that he spent a lot of time with him and his wife. That he spent a lot of times listening to Dr. Hawkins' stories that were mundane, that were from the mundane to the fantastic. And he didn't like stupid people, and he was condescending. So one of Dr. Hawkins' children, John, also had an encounter with a man in black when he was with his wife, Maureen. So John received a phone call from someone who claimed to know him, who wanted to visit. Then John went to pick up this person, and this person also had a female companion, and they took him back to his home. And they described that these two strangers, this strange couple, began asking and behaving in an inappropriate sexual way. They don't specify. And it's also said that John Hopkins, the son of Dr. Hopkins, John and his wife Maureen were swingers. So John moved to Florida with his wife and mother. And John called Howard asking to come stay with him in Maine for a few days for a visit. But John never showed up because Maureen actually murdered him. And the two of them were involved in drugs and alcohol. So all these events lead the author to not trust Dr. Herbert Hopkins' story or Men in Black, because there's a lot of things that make Dr. Hawkins seem suspicious.